So Jamie, do you want to get started with that?
Yeah, so we can just do call to order.
Oh.
And so what time is it that we're calling to order?
9:32 a.m.
All right, 9:32 a.m., so we'll do a call to order. And then just if you two want to review the minutes to approve the minutes, that's the first preliminary item.
David, what do you think about the minutes?
I support the minutes as written.
Me too.
Okay, that was easy. So then the first item then is policy 304. We have two policies. We're going to talk about 304 and policy 117. And so policy 304, we did have some changes in law relative to certification. We also then modified to put it in the format to capture how this is tied into a goal and objective of the board. So we added the policy statement that we certainly recognize the certification standards are outlined in law, but the different certification avenues now do help the goal of hiring a highly qualified and diverse workforce, because there's different avenues that individuals can come into the teaching world. So we captured that in your policy statement. Then we updated as far as types of certificate. And then HR has a great link on their website as far as outlining the different certificates, how you renew that certificate. So we linked that in under E, so that's a new category. And then there's two areas we're recommending for deletion because those are covered in the negotiated agreement. And so those are the recommended changes we're bringing before you. And of course, if you have any questions, I ask Julie, our new director of HR, to be present as well.
Is it worth noting in the policy that these two sections are covered by the negotiated agreements, right? You have in red recommend deleting section, but right, so then this policy as drafted right now would end with 3044, classification of certificates. And I'm not certain, but would there be value in having a statement that other aspects such as employee evaluation and reimbursement for education expenses are covered in the negotiated agreements?
Yeah, and that's kind of, I think, parallel with what we did with the other policy change when we removed some things. We did indicate the title of the benefit and we cross-referenced the negotiated agreement. So we could say teacher observation evaluation and benefits associated for tuition reimbursement, because that's associated with your certificate, are covered in the negotiated agreement and can link that in as well. So I like that suggestion, and I think it parallels what we did with the other policy when we deleted. Great. What do you think, Liz? Can you live with it?
Yeah.
All right.
And just for the purposes of recording and for everyone, are the microphones on or off? Do we know?
This is on, David, so I think this is what's capturing audio in the meeting.
Yeah, these don't.
Okay, yeah, so not, good, thank you.
Yes. All right, well, thank you. All right, so now let's go to policy 117. We'll just reconfigure a little bit. Julie, thank you so much. You did a great job with all the questions I had.
So we wanted to have more of a workshop on 117 that was collaborative. So staff, community members, anybody. Like I said, we had intended to do this at a table where we could all sit together, but we also didn't tell anybody in the building. So we welcome anybody to come sit at the front table, and we can talk that way. We'd love to go through the policy. We've gotten edits from the Racial Equity Committee, proposed edits. We've gotten a group of edits from representatives from the NAACP here. And I think, I know that it's our goal to get this across the line and as good as possible.
Thank you, Keith.
So.
And I did bring hard copies of the suggested edits, both from the Racial Equity Committee and NAACP. Do you have a hard copy, Liz? Do you want one?
I'd love a hard copy. I have one copy. It's hard to behave yourself.
If you
So-
can, I will.
Who are we?
It has to be mutuality.
So who are we missing though up here? I mean, I think if you have an interest in,
I think
we just want to make sure everybody's got a seat at the front table here. Are we missing anybody that wants to come up and participate? Well, you can come sit with us too.
Hey,
Sabrina, Dr. Bell.
no,
I think it's just nice to do it this way.
And this one, just both.
This is our state.
Well, we should have one from the racial equity and that's yours. That way you have both.
Okay,
Because I think that's
This is
what we're
ours,
walking
yeah.
through. That one's yours.
that just came in.
Correct. And that was sent to.
I got it.
Mr.
I
Gadsden.
got it. We don't have our previous comments.
So those were incorporated?
So what I'll start with is, since we're all working together today, which is fantastic, I'd like just, everybody to just introduce yourselves, and if you represent an organization or a board committee, you can start with Sabrina.
My name is Sabrina Nail. I'm the ombudsman with Frederick County Public Schools.
Good morning, I'm Shanita Hawkins, parent and also member of the Racial Equity Committee.
Keith Harris, Executive Director of Accelerating Achievement and Equity.
Jamie Cannon, Chief Legal Services.
Willie Mahone from the Frederick County branch of the NAACP.
Elisa Andrade, I'm the vice chair of the Racial Equity Committee.
Sarah Gonzalez of the Racial Equity Committee. Camille Bell, the Racial Equity Committee.
Janine Stewart, Supervisor of Student Supports, and a lot of emphasis at the sign. Happy to be here.
Small level.
David Bass, Board of Education.
Really supportive of education. So, welcome. Thanks for, I think you all have, I'll say briefly that I know so many of you have put so much time and sweat and equity and blood and years into this. And, you know, one of the things that I'm very cognizant of is just how long these things take and how frustrating it is to watch this work happen or not happen or all the delays. So I just wanted to thank you all for your commitment to making this as good as possible and representing voices and perspectives. So thank you. Jamie, do you have an approach for how you want to work through, or shall we?
Well, I have a suggestion. So in the policy, we did capture a lot of the input from the last meeting. So I think this has been a real working, living document that we shared then, both with representatives from NAACP and REC. So today, oh, I'm sorry.
Sorry, just confirm, last meeting being the full board work session?
Yes, and that's outlined at the top. So yeah, after we had the feedback during the September 28th work session, the board asked us to then reconvene here to receive feedback one more time from Racial Equity and NAACP.
You need a copy?
I printed this one at home, but we can try.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, it's okay.
Are you okay with that, Lily?
Yeah, I
Okay.
just want to look at the PowerPoint and have it
Okay.
recorded.
Okay, sure. So we have captured a lot of the feedback from both organizations. However, this week, then we did receive additional suggestions for the policy committee to review. And so how we kind of set it up is that we could kind of walk through that at policy committee, which is why I gave you hard copies, to just, if you want to walk through the changes, to then we can deliberate to determine if we want to make any additional modifications before it goes back one more time to work session. So that's a little bit of the background and the status for today.
So, David, do you have a preference for how we dig in?
I think that, yeah, I mean, potentially starting, purpose, policy statement, et cetera, and then returning, I would prefer at the end to the title. We do need to return to what the title is. I would prefer to do that near the end of the meeting. I'd love to start with purpose.
So, when I look at the feedback pieces from both the Racial Equity Committee and the NAACP,
One thing if it's okay, Liz, one thing I'd like to bring forward on purpose, right? A major point I think brought forward, particularly by the Racial Equity Committee, how will we not tolerate any actions of racism, right? Operationalizing this, I have in my notes, yeah, basically, how will we not tolerate racism? And I do think this needs to be explicitly stated in the purpose.
Well, so that's an important question. So we have discipline, right? We have for personnel issues, we have HR processes. So what's the posture? Will be dealt with immediate? I mean, so this is the $1 million question, right? Because the perception is still that while FCPS deals with, say, it's a student discipline issue, that the results of that, because of confidentiality or other reasons, are not public enough for people to realize that it was dealt with. And so I think that's the piece where regulations and communication have to change. So do folks have suggestions about how to
Could there be an addition of where it says, the Board of Education of Frederick County, the Board of Education of Frederick County Board seeks to prevent and eradicate racism in FCPS through, as you said, Ms. Barrett, discipline and human resource processes, period. The board will not tolerate acts of racism, and then continue on. And maybe just stating exactly what you said. It's hard to go over silence. Stating exactly what you said. How will we eradicate it? Through the student discipline policies, human resource policies, etc.
So could we start though with, the shared expectation that it's unacceptable, the education piece that goes with that, through consistent communication, and then talk about the discipline and the consequences. So it's clear that there's responsibility on both ends of that work.
I'm having some problem hearing you.
Huh?
I'm having some problem hearing you, Liz.
I'm having trouble hearing everything these days. So I was saying that I appreciated the suggestions here about adding the discipline and the consequences, but I think if we say up front that FCPS's job is to consistently communicate the expectation of no racism, no racist acts, or to educate the community, the whole school community, and then follow up with consistent discipline and HR procedures that are as transparent and well communicated as they can be under the law.
I like that. It seems to, one, I think we have to separate. We're talking about individual acts of discrimination, individual acts of racism. And so that would probably fall under disciplinary procedures. Probably. But when we start talking about systemic acts or systemic issues, that may be addressed through, I think you said HR, which makes sense, but there may be other kinds of ways in which to address the systemic thing. I think the data collection and reporting may be a way in which to address that, but also some kind of enforcement, involved in the systemic thing. When we start talking about the individual acts or whatever, we have a system now for enforcement. As you indicated, one of the drawbacks is the lack of transparency as to what happens at the end of that system. And we recognize the confidentiality aspects of that in terms of the students or whatever. However, there may be some ways to get around that. I think maybe we ask counsel whether there's some exceptions. I haven't researched it, but there may be some exceptions or some ways to get around it. I haven't researched it, but that may be there. The other thing, in terms of reporting it, you may not be able to report, with specificity what happened to this individual child or whatever, but there are certain ways in which to report.
Yeah, and I think we
Yes.
built this dashboard kind of piece in that's ongoing with the reporting. So I think so we have the established reporting schedule for achievement data. So I think that's the culture data under, access to achievement data.
Mm.
So Dr. Harris, you were gonna say something else.
No, you're right. Any incident of racism or perceived racism, when it's recorded in our system, they, principals have to specifically indicate that this was racially motivated. And so that's a way that we keep a track of it and are able to extract the data to say how many and what types of racist-based incidences we're having in the school system.
Yeah, I understand that, but what I'm interested in, and like what parents are interested in, what communities are interested in, is the outcome. What is the outcome? This happened, my child was called certain names or whatever, it went through the system. What happened to the perpetrator of that? Now, we enter into confidentiality and privacy and all those things at that particular point. Maybe we can make maybe that can be a legislative response to that. I don't want to get into the murkiness of the law there, but I think that's something that can be looked at.
So,
But what I'm talking about, do we report that there was a certain amount of incidents that were racial in nature, involved name calling, that occurred at this school?
We track that.
And as a result of those, we had a suspension here, we had a counseling here, we had an intervention here. Is that the kind, can we gather and report that data? Or are we currently
Yeah.
gathering and reporting that data? So if I went somewhere, I could see that at Valley Creek Elementary, there were a certain amount of incidents, and there were 5 incidents. One resulted in a suspension, one resulted in counseling, one resulted in some other form of intervention. Is that the kind of stuff, are we gathering and reporting that at this point?
So reporting publicly that type of detail, no. However, do we have the capacity to now with our data reporting system, we can say these are the types of incidences, and given the number, we can generally say it resulted in these types of follow-up actions.
I think we need
So-
more than that. I don't see it's a violation.
So
of anything.
I want to just, I'm not interrupting you today.
Go ahead.
I'm saying that under F, we have the board directs the superintendent to have to continuously improve the means and methods that students, parents have, everybody has to report. Every school and workplace should have consistent signage and reporting tools. And then the board directs the superintendent to establish a reporting schedule that allows all data herein, you can't even edit that word, to be reported to the board in the public in a timely fashion and as data become available through the surveys. Measures may be divided across a minimum of a quarterly reporting schedule. And then additional presentations. So I think what I hear everybody saying is that we should tighten up that new proposed second bullet to say, we'll have a public dashboard, there'll be reports to the board. It's because right now, the minimum quarterly reporting schedule, would that solve the issue? So we're gonna look at incidences of racist acts as specifically as possible without compromising student privacy. And they're gonna be reported, wherever they need to be reported to legally, but they'll also be on our webpage, right?
Yeah.
Can we do that?
Well, and especially the statement of, and I liked actually some of the modifications where you were going, Liz, with the purpose statement. So the purpose statement, we want to keep broad, but your language as far as, consistently communicate, educate the community and then follow up with practices to be as transparent as possible. So that's a good, I think,
Well,
broad
expectation
edit.
setting, I think, is a big part of that too.
Yes, and so that then is kind of the roadmap for then all the detailed hiring. What does that look like? This reporting structure with the dashboard relative to that. So I think expanding the purpose statement, gathering some of the suggestions from the first document that we were given, then all things will flow from that. So I did write down some of the language, because you're right, there is the transparency to the extent possible, because there was 2 incidents at a school, and what FERPA says, if you can easily identify the student based on putting pieces of information together. So that's why sometimes if there's an aggregate data of less than 7 students, we can't report out.
So, and that's an interesting point, because the FERPA question that I have, that I want folks to go back and research, because I think we've been too dependent on like sort of that older definition. I mean, I'm not saying it's an older definition of FERPA, but in the day of social media, where students publicly get on social media, and it's well advertised and well known, and they make a threat or they say a slur, and they do it in a public venue, FCPS hasn't identified those students.
Right.
So if FCPS were to say, you know, the equal outcome of a social media threat that's racist is X. So when we expectation set, it's not just let's be tolerant and nice and not say bad things. But when we expectation set, it's if you break FCPS's culture, then X happens. And I think that's what's lost in the discipline about school culture issues. I mean, you know, this is your area too, but I do think, because I think, to me, this stuff is different than, you know, taking someone's binder out of their locker. You know what I mean? Like, it's just, and that's, I think we're not making that clear to people.
Yeah, and
And
so.
as a parent, I don't feel it either, that it's clear.
And I think 2 things help us too, as far as, you're right, and we sometimes say, we as a school system can't redisclose. Is the information already public? Yes, but unless the student waives it or the parent waives it, we can't disclose it unless, and this is an important unless there is a duty to warn. So within that, if it's a threat motivated by race and then there's a threat to do harm, FERPA does say you can notify the family and the child.
But even beyond that, see, this is where I think we've got to take a step here. So if there's a public threat, if there is a TikTok threat that
Right.
literally is hurting not just the kids in the school, but it's hurting the whole school community because they're seeing this terrible racist thing.
Yeah.
And we can't say, we should be able to say that if somebody makes a threat like that, this is the discipline they face. We don't say that these kids are going to be suspended. We don't say that, but no way. And we've come out with statements that
Yeah, that's
say,
safe. I'm not
saying,
uncomfortable.
You know, we're going to take care of this, but like that's not enough for people.
Yeah.
I think they need to know that, you know, this will be swift and serious, and these are the 1, 2, 3 steps of discipline that we're going to follow for incidents like this.
Right.
And I think that could be communicated proactively.
Yeah.
And after a racist incident as well. And it wouldn't identify, right? I mean, it wouldn't personally identify the individual, but these are the discipline consequences of FCPS for racist actions.
Right.
I guess what I hear is more of the need for qualitative versus quantitative data to be analyzed as well, and saying that we're going to take this. And Dr. Harris was saying earlier that we do respond in certain ways, and I guess what you're trying to figure out is what are those ways. We map them out so that everyone is aware and increase our level of transparency. We definitely take steps, and so he's probably looking for what are they and how to make them more transparent, like outlined, right?
For me,
Yes. Because it sounds like I hear you asking for more accountability and more transparency, communication part about what possible steps or what definite steps. We can't tell you the definite steps for every single situation, but the possibility of them would probably be appreciated by our community.
Well, you would level it.
Right.
You have to level, like in schools, when students do certain things, they fall on level of discipline, a discipline matrix. So where would acts of racism fall? Would it be level 1, level 2, or level 3? And if it's a level 3, these are the consequences that are assigned to something if we say that this is where it's going to fall.
So that's exactly the point, right? Because we can sit here in policy committee and talk about that, but when it comes to making the regulation and doing the discipline part, I think what everybody's saying is that as long as you know, as long as the student knows what's not acceptable, and they're capable of acting in a way that's compliant, then we're saying this and this would be level 2 or level 3. You don't get a 1 because the whole school community has the expectation, right? So you don't get a 1, you know, obviously, you know, and that's, I think, that's part of the school's responsibility, the school system's responsibility is to communicate the expectation. So, and that's, I think, how you get to that zero tolerance, right?
Oh, no question.
Is to take the discipline matrix and simplify it and say for school culture, which is anti-racist and X, Y, and Z, this is what our discipline is going to look like. Is that legal to have a different?
Yes, and so 408 is your 10-page document on student discipline, consequences, et cetera. So that would be an outgrowth of this, that then the superintendent with the student services team and special education to carve out that area. We typically don't have what's called zero tolerance, because zero tolerance means any and all, because there are some, you know, comments that could be made as a manifestation. Somebody doesn't have the capacity to understand what
Yeah, I
they're
think
saying.
that's
So I
the
think
expectation. So if you have the ability and you've been informed what the expectations are.
you have the ability to inform, yeah.
Yeah.
Then I think that's
that
where that
sets-
would reside, in that policy, regulation change, our student discipline. Do you agree?
Yes.
So that's what we're directing here by, so back to the question about the word tolerance, that's what we're directing here, is that we're gonna spell out FCPS expectations and FCPS consequences through the discipline policy and through the reporting. That'll solve it, right? Clear reporting and discipline.
Yes.
Is that?
Yeah, I think this would improve the policy greatly.
I have additional question. The leveling and all that I'm very much aware of. I think I appeared before the Board of Education about 20 years ago. And I said that if you have a policy that says you come to school with a gun, you're out of here. And I said that we should do the same thing with these kinds of acts. So I understand the leveling, the consequences. My question, or my comment was on the victimized community, the parents, knowing what happened to that child that assaulted my child. We got confidentiality, but I think I heard us say that we could probably make some reporting as to how many incidents happened at this school and what the results of those incidents were. But I also heard someone say if there were only 2 or 3 incidents, then by doing that, you do identify the child in some way. Is that what I heard?
Well, what it says is if it would be obvious it's on its face, you know, like if it said a male student, 7th grade, you know, it's an identifier in FERPA and also with the state board as far as aggregate data. And if it's so small of a group and you could figure out the identity of a student, what it says is then to release that data, if somebody could easily figure it out, then you have to be mindful of that.
I would be supportive of a statement. The board supports releasing the consequences received by someone perpetrating a racist act to the fullest extent of the law or the fullest extent allowed by FERPA. Unfortunately, it still leaves you know, a level of scrutiny for the legal team to determine what that full extent is.
To being shared with the victim.
Certainly
Not
with the
publicly.
victim's family.
Okay.
And I think that's most important. I mean, I would support sharing with the public to the full extent allowed under FERPA. I don't think there's reason to I don't think there's reason to hide the consequences that someone faces for a racist action. I'd like it to be as wide as allowed under the law.
So what I was trying to communicate earlier was the fact that, you know, we have the numbers piece, right? Let's say 2 incidents happened in the school community versus one that can happen on social media and it's gonna have more of an impact on the entire community. The bottom line is somebody is harmed, the community is harmed, people are harmed, and how do we restore it? So whether it's quantitatively 2 pieces of data that we have, or whether we know that there is a school that is in need, how do we make a policy that ensures that as a result of these things, whether there are 2 or just one that was very egregious and had a huge impact, that we respond and that the public knows how we plan to respond each time.
And I think that's where that tiered discipline, we take away no offense, but we take away the 10 pages and we just have a table that says, a slur at a game, this is what happens. And we have many examples over the last several years to choose from in terms of saying, social media threats, a school-wide threat, and then, what the consequence. And you still have your tiers 1, 2, and 3 for discipline, but, you go to a 3 or you go to, but I'm sitting here with the restorative justice thing happening and thinking about what you said about coming back into the education piece, because if you've done harm to a school community or the whole school system, then part of that regulation has to be coming back in with a resetting of expectations again, right?
Yeah.
And saying, this was unacceptable.
Yeah.
So.
Could it be inclusive of duly restorative justice practices inclusive of X, Y, Z in addition to like the tiered?
Consequence, we typically care.
Yeah.
Alternative.
Yeah, because there needs to be healing involved.
So are these changes we're thinking about under expectations where we've talked about reporting acts of racism or kind of through bullying harassment, but then identifying our reporting out of disciplinary consequences? That's where we could link in 408 and then talk a little bit about the sharing of the consequences and maybe even restorative practices will be, shared. Because I think restorative practices also help a community to heal. Like, the consequence feel right, but then we also are educating the importance of that restorative justice piece. That I think, and I'll certainly defer to Janine, as far as, is that an important piece of information to share out, not only the consequence, but the restorative justice interventions?
Yeah, I think that allowing people to sit together and understand the impact on the community is, important. I mean, I also think the consequences are important sometimes too. So it's a combination of the 2.
Okay.
I think restorative justice is essential. I think it's more than just important. I think it's essential because you have to restore the individual who's the perpetrator as well as the victim. So I think it's just essential to have restorative justice in there. That's why I was talking about different kinds of modes of intervention in terms of that. So yeah.
I think Ms. Kenner, if I heard her correctly, was asking about at the end of the process. Historically, at the end of like a process, something big like that, we would communicate to the community. As a result of this happened, we're working on this. And so they understand that the restorative piece is part of the process. This happened as a result of this, then this happened.
And oftentimes, it's kind of what we normally do too, is the voices, the listening part of it, and allowing their voices, whether they know exactly what happened or not, allowing them to come and speak and share their voices is a restorative approach.
I like that. Okay, so I'll work on that section as an edit change under 4.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is probably going to be editing the regulation.
Yeah.
Quickly, because I do think there's no way to set this policy up without being able to refer to a regulation that's much clearer about the consequences.
I agree.
Because I think that's part of the community expectation setting, is sharing that out and saying, look, we didn't just make a policy, because my whole concern since day one is that this is just going to be like not actionable, right? I think that gets to it. So can we agree that we've addressed both the racial equity questions about definition of no tolerance under purpose, and also we've dealt with expectations for reporting incidents and outcomes. Anybody have, we can obviously come back to those, but.
I would say that NAACP made specific, statements and comments on the policy. The one that we have today, the statement from NAACP, is more of a conclusionary summary. But we made specific suggestions, before, and I don't have them before me here.
When in some of the red language.
Yeah, I see,
anyway.
I see some of the red language that does include that. I'm not sure that it includes all of ours.
No, the policy committee in work session didn't give us direction to incorporate all of them. We incorporated some, but we still had others to discuss. So that's exactly right. You're seeing some, but not all.
Right, and so is this the opportunity to address those some that we had put forth that was not included?
I would say yes, as we go through the policy, if you have
I don't have
things
before.
that to be added to either policy statement or definition, et cetera, yes.
It would be nice if I had it before me. I will say this. I heard rumblings that this meeting was going to occur, but I didn't know specifically the contours of it. And had I known specifically the contours of it, I would have bought all those other statements that we made. So, I guess that's by way of apology.
I think that, if there's anything glaring that we missed, I feel like we incorporated it. And then we just got the new set of feedback, so.
To be clear, our latest submission was more a summary, basically complaining about us not being incorporated into the process to the extent that we thought we needed to be incorporated. It does not set out specifically, yes, that's it, it's dated October 24.
There you go.
And what that is, to make it clear to everyone, this is basically a summary of some of our concerns about the entire process. It does not include some of the very specifics that we made, similar to the October 18, 2002 document from the Equity Committee. We did something very similar to this before, and this is not what's here.
Oh, yes.
Dr.
it is.
Harris,
You need
He
this?
has it. In his,
Yeah.
here. I think
There you
this is
go.
what you're referencing.
Yeah, that would be helpful. That would be helpful. Thank you, Dr. Harris. That would be
No problem.
helpful. That would be helpful. Okay. All right, since I have that, I can probably follow along. That would be helpful.
So I apologize, I was out of the room for a moment. Did we talk about setting expectations for staff also? Or when I came back, I was hearing mostly about students.
Yes. just
We
you.
did.
Yeah.
My apologies, thank you.
I think we implied that. It's a good question.
Should we look at section 2 policy statement?
Okay.
Yep, so let's look at section 2 policy statement.
And we're looking at the fourth bullet.
Yes.
Mhm.
Right, Racial Equity Committee suggested, rather than actual or perceived personal characteristics, could say instead not be predictable by race. In my notes, I was wondering if we say not be predictable by race or other demographic characteristics. But do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, Sarah, do you want to?
I'm still formulating my.
Okay, sorry, I heard you, so I didn't.
No, I do, for me, I feel like the actual perceived piece is a little bit important because at least in my experience, people may assume, right, whoever you are, especially if you're someone who's of mixed racial background, that can create friction on both ends. So I do believe that it's important to include that with race specifically forward, But also the second piece, you know, we really strongly feel like we need to be talking about student opportunity gaps rather than achievement gaps.
Correct, and that was something that we saw throughout the entire policy. Again, noting that when you say achievement gaps, that puts the onus on the students as opposed to the onus on our system as a whole. So we wanted to make sure that throughout, that we strongly advocated for it to state opportunity gaps. Because that's our onus, not the babies. And I completely advocate with Sarah as far as the perceived race, because that's important to us. But definitely that focus on race, since that's what the policy is about.
So typically, when we speak about gaps, we talk about achievement and opportunity gaps, because we recognize as a school system that there are gaps in students who are achieving at certain levels. But then when we talk about opportunity gaps in FCPS, we talk about students not being provided with the same level of access to certain opportunities and programs and services and supports.
So our point with that was that they're not achieving due to the lack of opportunity. And that's where the opportunity comes ahead of the achievement. They're not achieving because as a system, and I don't just mean FCPS, I just mean the school education system as a whole across our country, our babies are not achieving due to the lack of opportunity, which is why then further down we get into that whole ensuring we provide opportunity and access to the IB courses, the magnet programs, etc. It's kind of like a chicken egg type situation, that it's because of the lack of opportunity that our students are not achieving. So that's why we strongly advocate for the opportunity gap to be throughout the policy.
Was that
One-
an addition or is that a
In-
replacement?
In lieu of
One,
achievement, because it's on, again, the onus is on us.
I guess one question, say the last bullet point in policy statement. I think we should still keep that phrase, thereby providing settings for education that promote achievement. Right, like in a circumstance like that, I don't think achievement needs to be replaced with opportunity.
I think it's like the sort of passive assumption. I've done a lot of reading about this, and I'm not sure, like, you know, the assumption of the onus, right? And it's like, I think the phrase "and gaps," or whatever the word is in gaps, is because gap is kind of passive when it's achievement gap, or when it's an opportunity gap, you know, so I think maybe if we just like get rid of gap necessarily, and maybe look at you know, discrepancies in student opportunities and outcomes, or
I like that a lot.
I don't know if outcomes is much different than, you know, individual student success. You know, I know we measure, I know you don't, there's nothing that happens unless you measure it, right? And we're measuring achievement data.
We are measuring achievement
Yes.
data.
Exactly. I don't want a situation where, so, right, I do think it's both. I think we need to ensure opportunities are equal and equitable, but we need to continue to look at achievement data to ensure, I don't know, to ensure we're doing right as a school system.
Yeah, so I think it's the expectation that we're constantly, I like maybe ending that with educational outcomes shall not be predicted by actual perceived personal characteristics, period. And then something like, we will identify, track, address, and eliminate discrepancies in like opportunity, success, outcomes, and achievement. Something like that, that's more active.
Yeah, I like to keep the word gap in there because we got a gap. And we got an achievement gap, let's put achievement gap in there.
But there's so many pieces of that gap though. I mean, I think one thing that we know is that we've been talking about the gap. Well, how many years have you been doing this?
No. Close to 40 years, and the gap is still here. And that's because we only talked about the gap. Here we're talking about doing something about the gap, theoretically. So I don't see why we don't put the gap in there.
But the gap is complicated, right? So we gotta say, I agree with you. But I agree that we've been talking about the gap, but if we say something different, I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but they are discrepancies in opportunity, in outcome, in grades, in AP participation, you know, maybe in orchestra. I mean, it could be any of that, right? And so those specific discrepancies, we've got to figure out which ones are the ones that matter most to the gap, right? To reducing the gap.
And
So
that's
which ones are we going to track?
Well, that's interesting because what do we use? We use achievement. We use SAT scores. We use GPA. That's what we use. When you say which are the ones that are most focused, those are the ones that we actually end up using. SAT scores, GPAs, whether or not you took honors classes, those are the things that we actually use. And that's how we determine the quote unquote gap in the discussions that we normally have. But I agree, it should be expanded when we start talking about gaps. And that's why I think we need a multicultural curriculum.
So I have
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I interrupted you.
No,
Did you?
I was
Oh, okay. So am I understanding everyone correctly when we're saying that bullet 4 would then read, educational outcomes would not be predictable by actual or perceived race, and there's something to the effect of, and the system will identify, track, and eliminate discrepancies in opportunity, achievement, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Am I understanding that correctly?
Well, here's the edit. I just been following from the three-way conversation. And so can I hook my wagon on yours?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, please.
Because I want to get into your demographics. Educational outcomes shall not be predictable by actual or perceived race or demographics, period. The board will identify, track, and eliminate discrepancies in achievement and opportunity, gaps or outcomes. I mean, so we're still struggling with outcomes or gaps. That was kind of the melding as I was following it. Right, right.
What do we mean by demographic? Yeah, I mean, one of the biggest issues is by some definitions, right? Some definitions, Latino would not be considered a separate racial group. And certainly I think we need to address any Latino opportunity gaps in this policy, right? That there, by the most narrow definition, I think racial groups would be white, Black, Asian, and maybe that's it. And so I think Latino opportunities and achievements need to be certainly part of this.
But Latinos is not the only demographic. There could be other demographic as well. So when we use the word demographic, it's broad. I understand your concern about bringing in students of color, basis, and for all intents and purposes, what we're talking about, right? I think that's what we're talking about is color. But not to be oversimplistic, but when you use demographics, not only does it bring in Latinos, it brings in other quote demographics. And so we get further and further away from an anti-racist policy when we start talking about demographics, because it encompasses a broader universe of participants. So I think we should always say what we mean. If we mean Latinos, why not say Latinx, or at least Latinos? But I am concerned about the broad nature of quote demographic. This is an anti-racism policy. Some people call it eliminated racism. And so if it's anti-racism, then that's what we should be talking about.
I'm not necessarily opposed to having race and racial characteristics instead of demographic. But the most pressing issue for me on that is when I look at our achievement data, our most I don't know. Our biggest gaps are, in many cases, within the Latino community. And so we must ensure that is, I think we must ensure that's addressed in the policy. I think for me, it's understood within a policy to address racism, but it may not be understood by all.
A demographic is bringing a whole lot. And when you start talking about achievement gap, you got race, but we all know you got economic status. We got class. We got all those things that are involved in achievement. And so we're talking about race. Then we talk about achievement in the context of race here. And I agree that our Latinx brothers and sisters should be included. I have some concern that you're getting broader than race when you start talking about demographics.
So there's also the question about our population of students who may identify as learning English and where they fall in these various groups.
So this is not an anti.
I did not say
English.
that, I just am thinking out loud.
I'm gonna read the definitions of demographics and racism. Demographics examples: age, race, gender, ethnicity, religion, income, education, home ownership, sexual orientation, marital status, family size, health. So it's very broad. That's, I guess, what he's suggesting. Racism, defined as prejudice, discrimination, or antagonism directed against a person or people based on their membership in a particular race or ethnic group, typically one that is a minority or marginalized. So I don't know if that helps anybody, because we might be getting stuff on words here.
And that's based on the state definition as well for how they characterize racism and the monitoring and tracking of it.
One thing I do want to mention is thinking about, I'm always going to say that, one's experience of racism does vary by gender. And I think that's important to consider as well in terms of tracking, because as a person of color, you're going to experience very different forms of racism as opposed to a male or a male identifying person of color. And I think that's one thing we certainly want to keep in mind as we're tracking the trends over.
And for me, as someone who struggles sometimes to check a box because Latina is not sometimes under race, and I can tell you just from my own personal experience of filling out forms for my own kids, at keeping the demographics piece in addition to the race piece, from a personal level, it's important. I would advocate for adding demographics.
So why don't we call it a policy against race and demographics? Come on, folks, we're talking about race here. We can talk about demographics, or we can talk about Latinx identity. We can talk about all those things, but this is not what this policy is about here. And so if this policy is about race, let's talk about race. I agree that when we talk about race, we are talking about pigmentation to a large extent in this country. That's what we're talking about, to a large extent in this country. And so to the extent that people who are Latinx or whatever fall within that, then I think we should consider that. But when we start talking about gender identity and whether or not black males experience more or brown females experience more, I think we get a little bit of far here. I think we want to keep it focused on what we're talking about here.
When we take a look at those additional data pieces, it helps us to understand the context to answer the why. And so with this bullet here, it does specifically, in our revision, does specifically calls out race. But what we don't want to do is not monitor, track, and report other indicators that may suggest why this racial issue is occurring.
We don't object to that. I think you should report all of it. But I'm talking about this particular policy here. I agree. All of it should be tracked and reported. What's happening to the transgender community student body should be reported. I agree totally. You get no argument from me on that. I'm just saying in regards to this particular policy here, you can track, I hope you are tracking everything.
Yeah, for the purposes of this policy and the regular reporting that's supposed to occur with this policy, we want to track race, but we also want to present the contextual factors as well, relative to other ethnicities and demographics that may be associated with some patterns that we may identify based upon the racial incidences that we have. And so in the reporting of this policy, not only do we want to disaggregate by race, but what else is there to the story that will help us to understand what's going on? And that's why the demographics piece is there.
Sociology says if that's what your goal is. If your goal is to see other factors that are impacted upon that, to bring sociologists or anthropologists in. We are just not that broad, folks. I mean, we're just not that broad.
I appreciate, ultimately the board is gonna have to chew on this, right? I mean, we can be as laser focused, which I think we're trying to be to solve this racism issue. But I do think, we've heard perspectives by people sitting with you that indicate that their experience of racism is a little more nuanced than strictly color of skin. Is that a fair assessment? So I think maybe we can all chew on the word discrepancy, or not discrepancy, demographics.
Well, we can put it in and have it.
The expectation, because to me, that comes back to FCPS. And I think you, Dr. Harris, laid it out really well when you said, like the sociology textbook, kind of thing. But when you talked about FCPS's responsibility is to look at all the different pieces. And it's like the intersections, right? All the different pieces that are involved here. Maybe we can build that in.
Okay.
Are there any other comments about that?
So we're saying the word demographic is still up for further deliberation, consideration, or whatever. Is that what we're saying?
Yes, in fact, I think in the draft, it will remain for further discussion.
Demographic?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, the next step will be back with the full board for work sessions.
I just want to note that I vehemently object to that. I think demographic, I reiterate, demographic is very, very broad. And what has happened historically with the African-American struggle in this country is that the African-American black folks go out and then it gets petered out to everybody else. We see this in terms of the 13th Amendment and the debate between Frederick Douglass and the leaders of the women's franchise movement. Yeah. We saw that there, and we see it historically. We're talking about what's happening to black kids. Let's make it clear, folks. We're talking about what's happening to black kids. That doesn't mean we aren't talking about what happens to kids who are biracial. That doesn't mean that we aren't talking about what happens with kids who, because they a large black kid who is perceived as being older than he is. The data shows that a black child who is bigger is perceived being considerably older than they actually are. We got all of those things happening out here, folks. My objection is no. Let's move on.
One thing I wanted to suggest, just I'm being mindful that we have, 30 minutes, so we're fine on time. But I wanted to acknowledge that the Racial Equity Committee submitted a suggested edit that I would support and have a draft relative to hiring and training. So in the document that Keisha and Alicia submitted, they said there'd be value in adding text about us also looking and evaluating our turnover data and our retention efforts for diverse staff. I love that. And I did incorporate that just this morning in bullet 2, that where it says the board directs the superintendent to address barriers to hiring qualified and skilled professionals and to evaluate turnover data and retention efforts for diverse staff. So thank you for that. And I think that's a great edit that I would recommend that the policy committee make to bring them back to work session.
Yeah, and as part of that reporting, the one thing that I would like to get in here somewhere, and I think it goes under that transparency and reporting section, is that all the things that are gonna be reported, that they be reported on in mass, right? So it's kind of like a thing that we can go back to.
Mhm.
So it's the staff data, it's everything that relates, everything.
Of all
that's-
your letters.
Everything that stems down from this policy would
Mm-hmm.
be in one, so the racial equity committee can help us track it, so the community and all of our community partners can track, and
Yeah.
I think that's one of the things here.
Well, I think that's why we were intentional to say F is reporting transparency results of A to D above, A to E above. You know, that we're looking at all of that, right? Is that how
Yeah,
you were
but
looking
I
to?
just, I think taking, because I think
You did.
like, taking that down to, you know, having it report, all of it reported together.
All data. Well, that's why you see, you made fun of my herein. All data herein. Can I keep herein? You want a better word?
Like, you know what, it's all about the hearing.
Okay. So I didn't want to jump ahead because I thought we were kind of working through definitions, culture. So I think we're still looking at opportunity discrepancies or opportunity gaps. I'm going to put that in there for discussion at work session because I know that's still an area of conversation.
You're on page 2, culture right now?
Yes.
Okay.
And now
We're
I'm,
going down the racial equity committee,
yeah.
Okay. Good.
And so the page 2 culture, last bullet, racial equity committee representatives wanted us to look at under culture. They said we would like to additionally advocate for this bullet to be revised to gather data on student, staff, and family perceptions of school culture in order to include the voices of our family. That's the very last bullet under B. So B says the board directs the superintendent to gather data on student and staff perceptions. And then family, I think, is the primary addition headed, correct?
I think that's a great idea. I
Okay.
support that.
Okay. And then page 2, under attention, collaboration, and action, it looks like just seeking that confirmation that the bullying complaint is what we'll use to report acts of racism, that's where we pull that aggregated data. So I'm going to toss that to you, Keith.
Yeah, so with the complaint process, one of the things we've consistently talked about is making sure that it is very highly visible in our schools and that it is very easy for students to access. And so posted all over the schools, QR codes, so that it's very simple to complete the form and report it. And then those reports and data can go into a report whereby we can aggregate the report and the complaints based on race, types of incidences, et cetera.
And then do we have a category? Because I remember we did some modification of the form to include race-based bullying. So I just want to give an
Yes.
update. I think we did
In
make
our-
that modification based
Yep.
on your suggestion.
In our bullying regulation, we specifically call out for bullying based on race.
So I think we addressed then the hiring and training, and then the reporting transparency. I think we have added some
Can I ask you a
things.
question real fast?
Sure.
When you call out bullying data, if a student, I'm gonna get this wrong, so just help me. But if a student is bullied because the student is called like a slur that's directed because of their Latino origin or their skin color, and they are a student of color, whether they are Black, mixed race, is that race-based bullying?
Yes. And so one of the things we did in the policy is to really clarify that, because typically when you report bullying, it is about a repeated pattern of incidences. However, we clarified in that bullying policy the difference between bullying, intimidation, and harassment. And it only takes one incident to be able to report that incident and then follow a very specific procedure of following up with the student as well as the person that's been victimized and the victim themselves. That incorporates supports with restorative practice, discipline, counseling, those sort of things. But yes, it's specifically
I'm
reported
just
that
trying to
way.
get back to I'm trying to get back to that, and I don't want to go backwards, because that's not the right way to go, but
Mhm.
I do want to get it right with the demographics question that we were just talking about, because I think my question was really, if we're tracking, if race, we're tracking race
Mhm.
those ways anyway, that would include defining students who are Latino or appear to be students of color that might, if they're being bullied
Yes.
because of that perceived
Mhm.
characteristic, then that supports keeping that, right? Because it's, and I think, Mr. Does that answer?
You know what, I'm sorry, I was too busy trying to read something, but I heard you, could you repeat it, please?
No, I was just trying to say that the definition there, the school system is acting on the definition of racism to include students who are Latino. Right, because they're being discriminated against or they're being bullied because of perceived skin color or other characteristics associated with perceptions of race. And I'm getting this all wrong and I'm doing my best. So help me. But I'm saying that, to me, that supports keeping the idea of the demographic in there because, you can see things or everybody's variations are different with that. I'm just trying to get to the perceptions of that demographic for students who are Latino or mixed race students, right? They're already doing something about it. Does that make sense? They're already considering students who are Latino as it's a racist act.
That's a good thing.
So,
But what I'm saying is I think that's why that word belongs. And maybe I'm being crazy here.
I guess I do have some concern around, just in terms of time.
Yeah.
Just around, if there's additional parts of the policy we want to.
No, I'm trying to go back to that for a second because we just talked about. So
I'm looking at the bullying form where people self-complete this form. And it says actions, comments related to students' race/ethnicity. There's also racism as a choice. There's also racial ethnic harassment as a choice. So they're self-identifying.
Thank you, Sabrina. Okay, I think then the final thing then is maybe to come back and David, you kind of said as far as now we can kind of go to NAACP submitted input, but I think that primarily does focus a lot on the title. I don't want to speak for you, Willie, but if that's now kind of where we want to use the remainder of the time, I want to make sure.
I had a couple questions on curriculum that I at least want to
Oh, I'm
raise.
sorry.
We may not solve them, but I want to raise. When I look at curriculum on page 3, here are 2 questions I have. For that first bullet point, that sounds outstanding, right? FCPS will provide a pre-K to grade 12 curriculum that promotes equity, respect, and civility, et cetera. I guess my main question is, to what extent do we do this currently? Not to say that it shouldn't be in the policy, but I think it will help us determine, I don't know, what needs to change, how specific we need to be. So I'd like to know to what extent we do this currently in our curriculum development. My second question on curriculum, this one's a little tough for me. Third bullet point, all curriculum materials must be examined for racial bias as part of the curriculum review and implementation process. It's challenging for me in the sense of Who will do this? How will that examination take place? Yeah, I think there's a lot to be determined on that.
So I can give you an example, and then Dr. Bell can certainly chime in on this because she was tasked with doing a lot of work on this for us. So what happens currently is whenever there is curriculum writing or a revision to curriculum, the CII department, they consult with our department, and we usually will have staff to lens some of the work that they are doing and the revisions that they're making. Secondly, when it comes to examining materials for racial bias curriculum review and implementation process, we actually revised the tool, made recommendations to revise the tool that they have previously used for curriculum review. And we lens that to make sure that in each aspect of a curriculum review, it's considerate of matters of race, ethnicity, diversity, and the respecting of cultures, background, heritages, and experiences of students. So, Dr. Bell, did you want to add anything else?
Well, you summarized it quite nicely. We spent quite a bit of time as an AAA team, we did some research and looked at the template that we currently use at FCPS, and then added some very specific things around equity and ensuring that we're not bringing on materials in the school district that are biased, that are just not appropriate for students. So we did a healthy revision, and we're going to be moving in the next steps of the work soon.
We also do a lot of training with CII as well. We just had another training session last week or the week before, whereby we help their lens as they do their work when working with staff and then also reviewing their materials.
For me, that's very encouraging. I think maybe in a different discussion, it would be just interesting for me to hear more on how it changes our approach to curriculum. Is there particular curricular materials that previously would have been rejected that are now accepted, this kind of thing? But I'm encouraged by that. And I do think it should stay in the policy, but I'm encouraged that we're doing some of that work right now.
I have a comment on that. NAACP has been meeting with Dr. Cuppet for an extended period of time, maybe over like a year period of time. He made presentations from his respective departments as to what was going on in those departments concerning a pluralistic multicultural curriculum. And we were impressed by some of the things that he set forward. But our overall concern is that there should be a total evaluation of the curriculum by entities that have expertise in doing this. There are entities that do have expertise in coming in and looking at curriculum in terms of their multiculturalism. They've done it in several jurisdictions. Recently, they did it in Montgomery County. And as a result of that, they have come with some specific changes or whatever. We have advocated for that for quite a period of time. In our suggestions, one of the things that we said is that in talking about curriculum, we said in order for this to happen, adequate resources with an appropriated budget would be needed to hire outside skilled professionals that include the multicultural curriculum specialists to develop plans, set benchmarks, and things of that sort. This is what has happened in Montgomery County. I can share the information that we've gotten from that. We maintain that notwithstanding the efforts that are made by the school system itself, that specialists, outside specialists in this whole area of multicultural curriculum should be consulted and a relationship established with them to do so. That's our position on that. Again, in conversation with Dr. Cuppet and his staff, we were impressed with some of the things that were going on, but we left with the impression that we needed to have an entity that specializes in this to come in and do it. I reiterated that they did it in Montgomery County. I can provide members here with the articles that appeared in a Washington Post regarding that. We sat down and talked to the people in Montgomery County who orchestrated that. It was very, very interesting and informational. And I would think that we would really benefit from at least talking to them and see what they did.
So, yeah, so the board for the last fiscal cycle, you all approved funds set aside and dedicate for an equity climate survey. And so that request for proposals is out on the market right now. And so what you're saying, we're in the process of doing that. And a piece of the climate survey is taking a look at curriculum.
Great.
I think, to your point earlier, though, I want to make sure that, because this is the racism policy, multicultural curriculum, I think is a bigger piece that's
Sure.
ongoing.
Sure.
It's certainly part of
Sure.
the
Absolutely.
anti-racism.
Yeah.
So I think when Dr. Bell was talking about her, there's looking at curriculum pieces that are coming for with the anti-bias, this perspective. That's really specific work, and then I hear the broader multicultural thing. So I think that we're starting to take action on all of those fronts.
I just have a quick question. Is the tool, I think Dr. Harris, you mentioned that there's a tool that the district uses to go through, or maybe Dr. Bell, to go through this curriculum. Is that tool made public for the public to see? I know the board also has a curriculum committee, like the ethics committee. Is that something that they work on with you all to look at the tool?
So
So I'm gonna defer to Dr. Harris.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So there's an existing tool that's used for our curriculum review process when we're bringing on comprehensive curriculum. So the tool that we're talking about is still in the finalization stages. And so that's not a public document yet, because right now it's back in the hands of CII to really take a look at some of our suggestions and edits.
What tool did you all use? I think I hear you saying the tool is being developed, but I thought I heard reference to the tool that was already used.
There's an existing, whenever we do curriculum review of materials, CII curriculum department goes through an evaluation of those curriculum resources using an established process. There's a committee that goes through the tool and uses it to determine appropriate curriculum. And so all I'm saying is that we have lensed that tool to make sure that it doesn't have any biases, stereotypes, or inappropriate things that would not be supportive of all of our students.
I'd like to see the whole tool.
We have 10 minutes left, so
I'm gonna actually be excused. I had a meeting. I really.
Thank you for
Yeah. Oh, one thing I would like to say.
real quick though.
I'll say it quickly. The NAACP has reached out to other organizations in the African American community about this issue, and they have demonstrated an interest in being involved in this process. At least 2 organizations have specifically said they have an interest in being involved in this process. We have been sending them our positions, and I think we have something, the equity committee position, I want to share with them. I think it's very important to have those organizations involved in this entire process. I think it's tremendously important. And I want to say that, and in terms of moving forward, I would suggest very strongly that whatever schedule that we put, we modify it in such a way to get what I think is essential input from African American organizations in the community. Thank you.
Okay, so are we to a point where we should talk about the federal policy?
So,
Oh, go ahead, David.
I mean, I'll start with one point just on the title. I think for me, the biggest question here is whether there will be substantive differences in how the policy is written, implemented, and experienced by our people, our students and staff and families and schools, if we go with the anti-racism title as opposed to the addressing and eliminating racism in FCPS. That drives my thinking on this. So much of what the changes that I want to see are in the details of the policy. And so that's what I want to know more about. Would things be substantively different with the title of anti-racism?
I could be excused, but I want to comment before I go. The answer is no. The answer is it's what the substance is. And so if it doesn't make a difference in terms of which name to be used, then why not use the anti-racism? And the reason why you use anti-racism is the strongest statement. It says no to racism. Eliminating racism kind of like says, well, we got racism here and we're going to eliminate it. Anti-racism said, not only is it going to be eliminated, it's not going to happen in the future. We're anti-racism. We aren't into eliminating, we're anti-racism. And it's a much stronger statement. It may not resonate so well with some segments of the community, but coming from the perspective of the victimized community, I just don't think if you got African-American organizations that came to the table and you asked them which one they're going to opt to, I think they're going to say anti-racism. And this is indeed the victimized community. Anti-racism is a stronger statement. It says no to racism here, like George Wallace said, segregation now, segregation forever. It says no to racism now, no to racism in the future, no to racism forever. That's my reading on that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Anybody else?
The Racial Equity Committee does stand with NAACP on that with the difference of the definitions. There is a strong difference of the definitions, yes. But will it impact the meaning of what's down below? No, it won't. Because what's down below is really what we're gonna do.
Mm-hmm.
So are you asking, does the title actually make a difference in each section and how it's written? Probably not. It's just a different word. But do we agree with the NAACP that we would, if we have an option that we prefer anti-racism? Absolutely.
I think addressing and eliminating racism in Frederick County Public Schools sounds like a goal versus a title. To answer your question.
Yes.
Sounds what?
Like a goal, like an outcome versus a title.
So we're saying that.
Not
saying-
So I was answering your specific question
Yes.
you asked was this, for me as a person, I feel like it sounds like that's one of our outcomes versus what we're doing. Like,
Let's do it.
I'm not quite there yet. I guess a couple of things. A few things I want to say on this. Number one, so critical that we have a definition of institutional racism in the definitions. This policy would miss the point and would be too weak without the definition of institutional racism. Sort of on that, and I am conscious of time, but I think it relates. Do we also, either NAACP or Racial Equity Committee brought forward that we may also need a definition of structural racism? I have to say, for me, it's always been synonymous. You would see that structural racism would have a different definition from institutional racism? Okay. In that case, if it's a different definition, I certainly support having a definition of structural racism. I think it may be.
Can I say one thing on that?
Yeah,
Just because it's on that. I really, the definitions, I'm speaking as a board member who's gonna watch this thing get bogged down by community conversations that are not helpful. The more definitions you add to this policy does not help. And I'm saying that because I think there's so many people that, they see racism, they hear racism, I think we define racism in the regulation. I think we take, because that's the operational boots on the ground for everybody, and I think that's the expectation setting that'll happen. But I'm concerned because I'm never concerned about public perception. I mean, hello, but what I am concerned about is having this derailed. And that is what I'm trying to balance right now. And I'm saying that in a public meeting, right? Because I do think it's a real possibility that, but I think we have to define those things later. And I think we actually have existing materials that have attempted and started to and done a good job of identifying some of those definitions. It's almost putting the teeth behind it right now. So
I share some of your concerns about this being derailed, because if we don't pass this policy, I think students will be hurt or will continue to be hurt. I think for me, it was important to have institutional racism defined in this so that it's not, so that there can be no mistake that the policy is only about individual racist actions. The policy we know that the policy is also about how FCPS will systemically address racism. I feel that, I don't know, I do know. I feel that having the institutional racism definition in there is very important. Yeah, in terms of title, there's been a lot of talk of, we need to ensure to get this, to take our time and get this right and all of that. But I guess I feel the other side of the urgency of, I think there's students and families and staff who will be greatly benefited by FCPS having this policy. I want this policy passed as soon as possible. And I think that, and I see that occurring in a more timely way, in my opinion, with the title of addressing and eliminating racism.
I think you and I have said the same thing in the last 5 minutes, which is, I mean, I guess it's our job. I mean, to me, it's our job as board members to say to the rest of the board, right, because we're bringing this from policy, is to say, look, our community has spoken. We've brought people to the table. They've told us over and over again that this is a better policy and more beneficial and means more if these words appear. And then let our friends, chew on it, but say, I think if people say this is important.
For clarification, I want to make sure I understand. Is your preference that the title be anti-racism, but definitions go into the regulation, not into the policy?
I think we leave I think we leave the definitions that are in there. And then we move all the other pieces of definitions to the regulation. But I think we call it anti-racism.
It's very difficult when we have 2 and not 3 or more members.
May I ask your hesitation on the anti-racism?
I think it's multifaceted. I think one is, so I've had a perception, which I've corrected myself with a little bit of research, but I've had a perception that the term anti-racism is extremely modern. That if we were having this discussion, which we needed to as a school system 5 years ago, that we wouldn't be talking about the term anti-racism. Honestly, with just a little bit of research, I've seen that historians have been talking about anti-racism for many decades. So that was my perception. I've also proved my perception wrong, but I think in common parlance, in common points of discussion, anti-racism has really only entered common parlance, I think, in the last couple of years. And I want to ensure this is a policy that yeah, that like all aspects, that all folks from our school system can have support for. I think that it could end up creating unnecessary is a strange word, but I think there are folks who not only could support the policy, but would work diligently. I don't know, I think about, yeah, potentially individual principals or individual teachers, or I don't know, those would be two good examples where we need the policy implemented effectively in each and every school, in each and every classroom. And I just worry if we get into a big debate around an anti-racism policy, that there will be built-in animosity and built-in debate against it, even before the board does or does not pass this.
Well, it's interesting because it's almost like that result is actually what policy is trying to avoid.
That's what I said.
You know what I mean? Like
That's what I said.
and I've been round and round because, you know, it's like, what do you know, what conversations do you want to have in the boardroom? And, you know, if we still have principals or administrators who are resistant, right? Because all the tenets in the draft policy, all the tenets of being anti-racist are in there, right? Like we're trying to create students, not create, but we're trying to help students and administrators and our whole community be anti-racist. But
So would we not get to the substance of all the good stuff if, you know, we go to board discussion and, you know, I think our goal is to get this policy passed. The first thing we're going to talk about is the title. It's the first thing on the policy, which is why I think it was very astute of you to say, let's talk about that last. I thought that was very symbolic. And so is that our concern or fear that we're going to get derailed at the title and then all the good stuff doesn't get through? And I'd be curious, you know, and I don't want to overinterpret or things like that. I'm just watching what's happening in other school districts that have gotten really close. And then the controversies around the title and then the dies of natural causes. But Keith, what do you think?
So in listening to all of the conversation, one of the things that Ms. Barrett, Mr. Bass, you all are thinking about is making sure that we get to the actual work. And in a school system of 47,000 students, their families, all different types of perspectives, one of the questions that you're raising here is, what can a large school system of our size wrap their heads around and truly be work towards in implementing? Is it something that addresses and eliminates racism in FCPS, or is it anti-racism? Substantively, the policy is the policy. It's going to be implemented regardless of what title it is. The posture with the title, however, may be different. And so you're asking what substantially will change, and will there be a substantial change? By way of what's written here, no. By way of the posture that some may perceive, yeah. When, from the broader narrative, when you hear the term anti-racism, it puts up, some are automatically defensive regardless of the merits of the language in here. What you're talking about is, this is not about being defensive. This is not about discriminating against anyone, or it's not about having a culture where we want to force people to believe. What we're saying is, here are our expectations in Frederick County Public Schools. This is what we expect, regardless of what you call it. When you call it something, then that automatically in our school system, in our community, raises up a lot of defenses regardless of the merits that's here.
I mean, I'd like to hear. Thank you.
I just think respectfully, the level of racist acts that have happened in this county since I have been here are unacceptable, period. Everybody knows that. So since I've been in this county, we've talked about the important work around equity, around creating an equitable school system, and that we have to be just as serious. If people didn't like the name bullying harassment policy, would they then be allowed to bully and harass people just because they don't like the name? So the expectation is this is the policy, we need to follow it, and it's going to drive discussion. We know it's going to drive discussion. My thought process is let the discussions happen, and then we move forward, because the execution of the work doesn't come from the peanut gallery. The execution of the work come from the practitioners in the community. So I think that it is very important for our policy to match our belief system, to match our actions, and our words. I cannot stand to watch people vehemently get discriminated against and we cautiously correct the people who do it. It's not okay. You vehemently did all of these things and work quietly because we don't want to upset people. No. The stance is, here's a very thoughtful, very well-written policy that's very inclusive. And as an employee, as a person in the FCPS community, the expectation is that you're going to follow that policy. And if you do not, there's another policy for that as well. There's a policy for everything. So I think we just need to be mindful of that, and then, work earnestly and cautiously forward to get the outcomes that we want, because the only outcome is there is no racism in Frederick County. That's the only outcome. So I feel like we need to call it what it is, and we need to move forward, and we need to be respectful and educate and do all of our restorative practices, bring in all of our PBIS, and make sure that we're speaking the language. We're making it part of the culture by actualizing the expectation and not just putting it in a policy, but putting the policy, teaching the policy, training the policy, making sure that all of our systemic PDs are aligned with our policy, because basically for some people, you're setting a completely new normal in terms of their thinking. So I might not like what Dr. Bell looks like, but I know that in this establishment, it's unacceptable to say that I don't like you because you're Black. You understand? So for me, that's the only stance I could take, being what I've been through here in Frederick County.
And speaking as a principal, from 2016 to 2019 at Ballinger Creek Middle School, I remember my administrative team wanting something more of a posture. And as administrators, we move from school to school. So not just in the Ballinger area, but in other areas, there have been principals that we have worked with, collaborated, asking for more, to use your word, a posture. So I don't know if we need to take a vote here or what. It sounds like although it's only two, but there's still public opinion.
I like the idea of changing culture. I think the language is the posture, it's the culture that we're setting. I like it because it's proactive, addressing and eliminate. It's like where it's not just expecting you to follow the rules, but it's expecting you to really change the way we're expecting you to change the way you view things, and I think that's
A thought that I would like to put out there is a policy title of eliminating racism in Frederick County Public Schools. I think there is a way that addressing assumes continued racism, and eliminating is what we need to do.
I have two requests really quickly because I saw you, Ms. Garrett, look at your watch. So really quickly before this ends, I have two requests on behalf of the Racial Equity Committee. I'd like to request that our feedback on the policy be officially placed on board docs for today's meeting. I'd also like to officially request, because I'm gonna put it into the universe, that then when this goes into action and consent on November 8th, that meeting occurs at 6 p.m. so that it can be available and equitable for those of us who would like to attend that meeting and make public comment on such an impactful policy. Because many of us today asked for the time off to come here this morning. So I'd really like to make, whenever that does happen on November 8th, hopefully, that meeting occurs at 6 p.m.
I'm in full support of having it on board docs. I think, having these discussions at the 6 p.m. Board meetings, I support, and I support having this done as soon as possible. Well, I think November 8th is a Tuesday, but November 9th is probably the Wednesday. I would like to see this brought forward at the November 9th meeting, and I'm not certain. No, I don't know. I would like to see this brought forward for the November 9th meeting.
I think we can make the changes to it. I mean, I'm on board to help with those events.
All right.
And I know that I chatted with Jay last night, and he's on board with that as well. Yeah.
So I need to
We
up-
have to make the decision about the title among the two of us.
Are you open to then having the title Eliminating Racism in Frederick County Public Schools?
I mean, to me, that's a plan B. I think that I am feeling very like the community is speaking to us and saying what's important to them, and they've shown up for the work, and I feel like that's where I stand, is anti-racism. So, I don't know what to do about that.
Well, we can put both. I mean, it's because
Yeah,
it's
we
a
could
work.
do-
So we could say, here's two options: eliminating,
I just-
taking away, addressing, and anti-racism. And I've carried this through the whole time.
So I need to go on record here and say I wasn't on board with that when I started this
Right.
process.
Mhm.
And because I've watched this policy turn into something that I do think will be actionable, will have the teeth to ideally help transform culture into something that's proactive.
So
And
the
that's
two
not just
choices-
my hope, it's my intent, because I do think that we've actually got tracking mechanisms and transparency. So I'm able to say, okay, we could have an anti-racism policy, because I think that this is doing all the things that word means to me.
So I can put in the title section, here are two title suggestions. One is eliminating racism in Frederick County Public Schools, and the second one is anti-racism in Frederick County Public Schools. And then we take it to the full board and see what happens.
I think we need to have the two title choices. I don't have a issue or preference necessarily with which one comes first.
Well, I usually do it alphabetical. I mean, normally in my drafting, it's alphabetical.
It's alphabetical, anti-racism comes first, but
Maybe we could do anti-race, we could do it like a master's thesis. Anti-racism, eliminating racism in Frederick County.
I continue to support the title of Eliminating Racism in Frederick County Public Schools, and I think there's value in allowing the full board to discuss the merits of both policy titles.
Okay, so I'll do it alphabetical. I'm optimistic. So I think I got the edits, but I will draft the edits to make sure that you see them before the November meeting, and before we post them. What I heard you say is that you would like us to post to board docs the two sets of comments that came in today under policy committee.
I don't know if we need to make a distinction. I'm open to a distinction between board committees, such as the Racial Equity Committee and community nonprofits. I am really, really pleased that us as that Jamie, as soon as you received the comments from community organizations like the NAACP, You emailed it to us,
Yeah.
excellent. I think there can be a distinction when it's a board committee, like the Racial Equity Committee,
Okay.
that go on board docs.
So do you want me to only put one set of comments to board docs?
That's my preference.
Yeah, I don't have a strong feeling. So David's strong preference.
Can strong prevail. So Faye? If you could
I hear
upload-
David's point that
yeah.
we're setting precedent for any
Yeah.
community organization.
I would
to
agree
have
with
their
that.
Comments put up on board docs, and we have talked about doing this policy a little bit in partnership with the Racial Equity Committee, who we charged, and they charged us to do something about stuff, so it makes sense that their comments would be there, so that's.
Yeah, I think that's an important rationale because it is your board doc. It's what you populate to what you need for your meeting. And so so if you deviate and you say, no, because there's difference of if I attach it as backup versus I'm uploading it. And so I think I would very much support your
It'll be
rationale.
entered as part of the minutes.
And for the purposes
Yes.
of discussion, or, right, since this is going to the full board, it probably makes sense, the same email that you sent of the NAACP comments to me, Jay, and Liz, probably send that to the full board.
So that'll be in the backup now that
In the
we're going.
backup.
Yeah, so it'll be attached now to that agenda item because it was backup that you reviewed today.
Yeah.
So you've incorporated it in today. So,
Okay.
you know, we'll say backup 1, backup 2, and it'll be incorporated. But as far as what's uploaded for our documents for the purpose of your meeting, uploading and attaching it are two different
I think in
things.
that case, it needs to be board committees, such as the Racial
Okay.
Equity Committee.
All right, we can do that. All right, well, that was productive. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.